How do organizations effectively tackle toxicity? Well, on this episode of the 11th Thing podcast, I will be exploring this with my special guest, best-selling author, board director, speaker, and founder of Clear Day Strategies, Dr. Brian Hughes. My name is Paul Aladinika, and you are listening to the 11th Thing podcast. Now, onto my special guest for this episode of the 11th Thing podcast. Dr. Brian Hughes is an executive advisor, best-selling author, keynote speaker, and founder of Clear Day Strategies. With more than 30 years of executive leadership experience, he has led large-scale operations across more than 40 commercial markets and managed over $1 billion in profit and loss responsibilities. He is the creator of the Culture Recovery Framework, the first peer-reviewed, scientifically validated operational model designed to help organizations recover from toxic leadership and rebuild healthy workplace cultures. Drawing on his extensive executive experience and doctoral research, Dr. Hughes advises boards, senior leaders, and HR executives on strengthening trust, improving talent retention, and creating high-performing organizations where people can thrive. His latest best-selling book, Toxicity, Let's Finally Do Something About It, is a practical guide to culture recovery, equipping organizational leaders to build resilient, high trust and high accountability environments where everyone feels valued and empowered. Dr. Brian Hughes, welcome to this episode of the 11th Thing podcast. It's great to have you on, sir.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Appreciate being here.
Excellent. So let's dive straight into the questions. So we're exploring your book, Toxicity. Let's finally do something about it. One of the central ideas in your book is that toxic leadership isn't primarily about aggression or bullying, but about leaders becoming focused on themselves rather than others. Why do you think we have misunderstood toxic leadership for so long?
Mm. Yeah, great question. I think part of the reason is people use the word toxic to describe anything that is uncomfortable or complex or drama filled, right? And so there's in maybe more academic settings, right, where you have these defined leadership typologies. Um, we'll use toxic, but we're not breaking it down maybe as far as it goes. And I'll give an example. So you could have somebody that is in military or first responder kind of status, and they could have an abusive nature, right? Abusive typology. The intentions could still be pure, but maybe they are overly aggressive, or they're trying to break people down. I'm thinking like military basic training that we might experience or hear stories or see in the movies, or somebody in a firefighting or a police or medical situation where there isn't time for pleasantries, right? There's life and death situations, so people are very short, very abrupt. They're not stopping to say, okay, am I saying this in the right way that's going to make somebody feel good? Instead, they're just trying to get stuff done, and that could be considered an abusive nature. What makes toxicity unique is it's more about the intentions than it is about the style. And across sociology, psychology, human capital management, and business, everybody was using toxicity or toxic as a descriptor, but not really as kind of like almost a true definition. Because I think toxicity or toxic in general creates more of a visceral or an emotional reaction, and so people really relate to it. Like we were talking off camera about how toxic cultures get people, and it does, and that really is because we have almost an empathy, if not sympathy, towards that, because we've all dealt with those kinds of people in our lives at some time. So I think just people don't understand where it really comes from, and that's where we just get these this confusion, I guess, for lack of a better word.
That's interesting, Brian. And if I can just sort of add a really quick supplementary to that as well, which is that why I mean, you've been really specific about isolating toxicity in a really quite specific way. Why do people just use it as a catch-all? Why has it become this sort of big catch-all term that's used to describe a whole sort of bundle basket of different behaviors. I mean, what do you think the thinking is behind that?
Um, I'd say two reasons. One of them, I maybe shared already at this point, which is the fact that from an academic setting,
Yeah.
people were using that word interchangeably. But also it creates that emotional reaction in people, or people use it as an emotional word to express. It's like trust or love. In the English language, we use these words interchangeably, but they, in other languages, perhaps they would break that down more finitely. I think the other reason is simply because maybe this is generational. That it's become more of a vernacular for millennials and Gen Z and now Gen Alpha to use this word toxic. And it would be different necessarily than, let's say, like boomers or Gen X would use. And so I don't fault anybody for that, but just there's been kind of a slide or a blur of what we think in our minds when that word gets used. Where really, if we're going to try to solve for it or build resiliency against it, we do need to be a little bit more specific. It can't be just this vague, anything that I don't like creates a toxic environment. I've done some posts recently on social media, and people will talk about, oh, well, when my boss expects us to work late after hours, that's a toxic environment. No, that's not a toxic environment. That could be any number of things, right? But you're describing a symptom of something you don't like, and that could be a high performance organization, it could be a deadline, it could be something that was fully within your job expectations, to complete a project on time or whatever. And for you personally, I'm thinking about this individual, it could clash against your personal boundaries of your work life balance, but that doesn't inherently make it toxic. What would make that circumstance toxic would be where there's a leader or supervisor that is manipulating individuals or is trying to push individuals for their own personal gain. And just for the sake of our conversation here, toxicity, or when we say toxic leaders are doing things for their own personal gain, that doesn't mean that somebody shouldn't be ambitious in their role, or they shouldn't be a high performer, or they shouldn't try to create levels of excellence that might impact their own financial well-being. Where toxicity comes in is when somebody will push and again manipulate and drive at the expense of others for their own gain, versus, let's say, a high performer that recognizes that if everybody wins, then I win. So it always comes back to intentions, even more so than style. And I'm sure we'll get into style as well.
That is really helpful, and I really appreciate you sort of unpacking it a little bit more, and being, really quite explicit in terms of the definitions and the description thereof. That was incredibly helpful. Let's go on to signs and signals, Brian, because I mean, toxicity can be subtle and quite difficult to detect at times. From your observations and from your research and indeed from your own experience, what are the early signs and signals that indicate that toxicity is a problem, is sort of brewing? And why are these early signs and signals sometimes so difficult for organizations to recognize and identify?
Mm. I'm actually going to start with that second part first. Part of the reason that it can become so difficult to identify these is regularly, and so I'm going to say better than 50% of individuals that are toxic are highly intelligent, and they're usually high performers at work as well. Again, it's the intentions, not necessarily the behaviors that make somebody toxic. And because of this, they know what to say first off in the interview. So the best that we can do to put together personality surveys, or we try to measure for fit, or we try to screen out individuals that would have maybe these toxic characteristics. And there's some tools that we can potentially, employ to try to do this. But at the end of the day, highly intelligent people know what to say and when to say it, so they're going to get by, right? That also includes when performance starts to decline, which is part of the reason why these signs, I could point to some signs, but some of these are difficult to spot because let's say you have an exit interview with somebody who leaves to go to another organization, and they share this person, how they have their inner circle, and you're either with them or you're against them. And some of these like behaviors, But when you're further up in an organizational chart, it's hard to see. You've got high performer who looks good, smells good, says all the right things at the right time. And then you've got this person who's already chosen to leave. And why do I want to listen to this person that's going to leave when the reality is and so sometimes people have difficulty seeing for themselves what other people are reporting, and that comes to, again, that manipulation, or sometimes it could be deflection or triangulation. This kind of the schoolyard idea where one person goes to another person and says, did you hear what this other person said about your mom, right, or your sister, or whatever, right? Trying to create antagonization where it didn't exist previously, and then using that as a deflection tactic. Because if they're dealing with, okay, my performance is waning because there's drama with these people here and I'm dealing with them, and if they've been a high performer, then senior leaders will say, okay, you're good, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Or again, they know what to say, and so they'll come in with data points that are not necessarily causational, but produce a confirmation bias and say, okay, well, here's these data points of market conditions that's why our business unit is having these challenges. So, I would, if I was looking for things to spot, I kind of lean towards these three, and I do this in my consulting practice when I'm looking, and these are most applicable to middle managers and above. Toxicity can exist anywhere. It can exist culturally, and we should probably explore that as well. But a toxic leader, the individual person, I'd look for a couple of things. And these aren't always indicators, but these are just warning signs that there may be something there. One is having a leader that has highly zealous followers. They have kind of their cult of personality. There's people that think that, if somebody got hit by a bus, then their leader should automatically become the CEO because they're that great. And there's some psychology around why that magnetism and that attraction happens, right? Both toxic leaders happen to be very charismatic, but also and I talk about this in other settings, but this idea of an invisible workplace, it's where it's beyond quiet quitting. It's where people just really have this high sense of loneliness and lack of meaning. I mean, we are dealing entirely with a loneliness epidemic, and you add that to a work where the typical worker feels and therefore acts like a commodity or a metric rather than an engaged, valued member of the organization. There's some follower susceptibility that is a risk profile. And so when you have highly zealous leaders, they may not even start out as toxic, but they can become toxic because unintentionally they realize that this group of employees becomes highly manipulatable. Maybe that's not the right word, but susceptible to these behaviors because they just want to belong. And so if they can get in that person's inner circle, then they put these blinders on and they can't see the bigger picture, right? So highly zealous followers can be an issue. If you're looking at employee surveys, right? Most organizations try to do this. Sometimes they're doing it for certification. Sometimes they're doing it for actual, merit value. And a toxic leader will regularly have very high scores, but they'll have very low participation. And that's something to watch for, because you might, if you're just looking at the scores, you're like, okay, great. Yeah, no problems. We're doing so awesome. And then you get the participation rate is down at like 15 or 20%. Okay, what do the other 80% of the people think? Again, this doesn't always mean that there's a toxic leader, but it's something worth investigating, because that other 80%, they could be either it doesn't matter what I say anyway, because corporate's never going to do anything about it, so they choose to opt out. Or number two, they'll fear some sort of retaliation or retribution because they don't trust, because again, toxic leaders break down trust first. They don't believe that the anonymous survey is truly anonymous. So there's some others, but those are probably the two that stand out the most.
Brian, this is Fascinating stuff. What you're highlighting is both the pathology and also the sociology of toxicity, which is just truly, truly, truly fascinating. I mean, it's a podcast in its own right, I think, some of the stuff that you're uncovering. Let's move on to let's move on to some of the conditions and some of the context that facilitate, enable, and perhaps even encourage this kind of behavior. So, many organizations judge leadership by results. Quite understandable, market share, profitability. Is it possible, Brian, that organizational success can become the very thing that protects toxic leadership because those results are used to justify the very behaviors that would otherwise be considered completely unacceptable?
Yes, and maybe if I can tangent for a little bit, I think we've in business culture and taught through the business schools and that I've seen throughout North America and Europe as well is this data driven mindset. And I don't fault that. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but from now decades of this, it's become part of our muscle memory. And unintentionally, this is partly what's contributing to the invisible workplace and the epidemic of loneliness, right? And there's other social media and family relations breaking down and other factors, right? There's so much there. But because of this data driven mindset, we focus on how do we move the dashboard indicator from yellow to green, right? We think in that way. Now, one of the things I noticed in my visits to the UK is the stoplights are different than the traffic lights are different than they are here in North America. In North America, it's green and then it'll go to yellow and then it'll go to red. Now, and I love visiting the UK throughout UK, but last time I was in London, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, which was that the lights it'll be red and then it'll go to yellow and then it'll go to green, right? And it's kind of like, hey, warning. But then as soon as it turns yellow, what do I see? Everybody in the motorcycles and on their bikes just go, right? And we're conditioned to chase the little blinking dot, and we chase these metrics without bigger picture. So, for example, and I'm not ready to release all the results of this. It's some research that I'm doing right now, but I'm finding that somewhere around 30% or up to 30% of what an organization spends in their labor line allocation on their P&L that's spent on labor is directly attributable to their culture in the organization. And just to frame that, maybe some obvious ones. When you have a poor culture, you would lose somebody that's maybe making a certain amount of dollars or pounds, right? Euros, wherever somebody's listening to this, and as they are then replaced, they're having to replace somebody at a higher dollar range than if they would have kept that person, right? So associate retention does that, or stay bonuses, or sometimes I call it hazard pay, where somebody has the work has become so, the work environment has become so unattractive that somebody who wasn't previously looking for another opportunity has now opened themselves up. They've now interviewed and now receive an offer from somebody else. And where for most generations, pay isn't even in the top 3 motivators why somebody would work for an organization. But when all the other motivators are non-existent, pay becomes the lowest common denominator. And so then somebody's willing to make a change. Well, since they're all the same anyway, there's no difference. I might as well just make more money. And so if people are coming back to you saying, look, I've got this offer over here, for 15% more, 20% more, right? So you end up paying to keep somebody who has institutional knowledge and paying them more. And so that becomes reflective of the culture, meaning that you could potentially, and I'm just using these round numbers, that if you solved for that culture issue, you could pay everybody 10 or 15% more and still see a material increase to your profit margins as a business just by your culture. So when people think that culture is squishy, or touchy feely, or because it doesn't necessarily line up in a data set or a metric, that no, at the end of the day, it becomes a superpower. And I think it was Inc. magazine. I apologize if I don't have the reference right on this, but it talked about a couple of organizations who've done this recently with AI, and looked at IKEA as an example. IKEA replaced, and again, I believe these numbers are correct, around 1,800 employees in their customer service department with AI. And of course, most people would say, "Oh, AI is taking our jobs," but because the culture was there, and what I mean by culture is the trust factor was there. That when IKEA said that, yes, we're doing this, but we're going to shift your responsibilities over to the right, and we're going to upscale what you're doing, there wasn't that same anxiety or fear factor because there was organizational trust and it was mutual. So as they shifted over, they and these were IKEA's deals, that the AI took care of this and kind of some minutia, retrained the same group of customer service agents who were great with clients. They were great on the phone. They were great with the relationship, turned them into design consultants, and stood up an entirely new division of their business that netted $1.4 billion in additional revenue last year. I mean, that's amazing. And so there's kind of this shift. So when we take it back to, the toxicity and the cultures, right? I think it's part of the conversation that we need to understand what are the underlying, what is it that everybody's looking for, right? Because part of the reason that toxicity is so hard to diagnose, or sorry, I guess so hard to see when you're just chasing symptoms around, is because, like positive culture, negative culture also doesn't reflect in your KPIs or KSIs or whatever metrics people are looking at, except for maybe those of your human resources or other people oversight groups that are looking at employee retention or some of those factors.
And that's really fascinating, Brian. And in some ways, it's a segue onto my next question, which focuses very much on the power dynamic. And you sort of highlighted some of that through a sort of a relational lens there. And I just want to get your sense and your perspective on the sort of the origins of toxicity, because it can originate both from the shop floor as well as from the C-suite. In your view, how are these manifestations different in character and personality? And is one more difficult to address than the other?
Interesting question. Because they stem from intentions, I don't know that they're necessarily that different. How it manifests may be different and therefore may be more material. So you would have workplace harassment. It might be sexual harassment. It might be, time theft. You might have some of those things that are more prevalent on the shop floor, where at a more senior level, you might see it manifest more in various types of financial fraud, expense account fraud, hiring, having a sense of cronyism and hiring other people that share the same kind of comfort level or acceptance of those kinds of behaviors. Maybe even misreporting financials for one's personal gain. I think it can, the results or the consequences can happen. Part of the reason I spend a lot of time talking about building resiliency is a toxic leader will test the waters. They'll see what's allowable. And as that happens, they become more emboldened. And then eventually it does catch up with them, right? Toxic leaders don't last forever. There's some point, and it might be legal claims or whistleblower or anything else like that. Positionality sometimes does act as a kind of protection. And that can happen in either direction, because again, toxic individuals, toxic leaders, supervisors, right? They're generally high performers. So you can have a toxic leader that's CEO, but when a certain number of complaints come forward, they're just driven, or it's a personality conflict. This person just didn't like their style. Look at their numbers. Of course, they can't be hurting the organization. Look at how well they're performing, right? And we see these types of behaviors quite often. And so, as I'm working with boards of directors in a company, either as a board member myself or working in a consulting capacity, is we have many, especially publicly traded or large scale corporate boards that are maybe federally or nationally supervised, I guess, for lack of a better word. Most of them have a risk committee, and they'll pair with the chief legal officer, and they will look at the risk management. This would be one of those things to look at, right? The risk management committee should also be looking at things like employee surveys, should be looking at things like turnover data, and seeing if there's ways to correspond increase in legal claims or other things, and not just to one individual, but does the culture allow for such things? I mean, we have enough risk to navigate with anything from governmental oversight and legislation to health and safety regulations. Organizations have that enough. We don't need another layer of people that are being treated poorly, and again, poorly to this extreme level of that toxic leaders would do, because then not only can it actually impact you financially, like we've already discussed, but it can also impact you in your brand reputation with customers. I've talked to individuals where they would say, yeah, I was actually recruited by such and such, maybe a US based tech company that was highly attractive, would have looked great on their resume. But they had friends that worked there, and they said that they had just spoken so poorly of what the culture was like inside, that this top talent wasn't willing to go there, because it's like, why do I want to go climb into the dumpster and roll around? I know what's already in there. I know what I'd feel like coming out of it. I'm not going to, there's no amount of money that makes that worth that, or resume tracking. And the same kind of conditions can exist at that shop level, because when you have high performers, it's easy to excuse away. Because when organizations as a whole think quarter to quarter for their performance to the board or to shareholders or other stakeholders, they're not thinking about, what do I do today that impacts next year? They're thinking, what do I do today that impacts this quarter? And I think that's, again, muscle memory. I don't think that's necessarily like we're short-sighted on purpose. I think it's just the way that business has become, and we have an opportunity to shift that and kind of bring our chin up and look forward a little bit more, instead of just down at the dashboard in front of us. So we'll see how that goes over time. But the shop floor person could be exhibiting these behaviors. Maybe the culture in that organization. I've worked with people all over the world, and it's interesting that you use the word power dynamic. That power dynamic, where I'm talking with engineers or others that are individual contributors, and I don't have any power at all to speak up against my supervisor. So that supervisor then has ultimate authority. So unless there is some sort of a mechanism for people to report up or go around, or that leader being trained that that their best interest is to have a collaborative environment, it's difficult. It's difficult to spot unless somebody further up does the skip level interviews. Somebody further up will check not only these symptoms, but what behaviors can we do today that will help build resiliency, so that when that toxic leader does come in, or if they kick out a toxic leader, right, what can we do to heal the organization, restore accountability, restore trust, and build that resiliency? Because if they don't, you remove a toxic leader, it's like a wound that has taken place but is never allowed to heal. Somebody else will fill that power vacuum, because those behaviors, while even though the original person was exited from the company, it will be perceived as allowable because it wasn't addressed appropriately. And then you just get a repeat cycle year over year.
And that's interesting, Brian, because that's a very question I was going to come to next, which is this idea of, how do you break that cycle of toxicity? And I know that in your book, you argue that organizations must first recognize the traditional patterns that encourage toxicity before they can begin to create sustainable organizational health. So it's almost like, get a clear understand, map your baseline, get a clear understanding of where you are and what the issues are and how they occur and who is involved. From your perspective, Brian, what are the most important patterns that leaders need to break?
Trying to figure out succinctly how to say this because it's the I'm going to speak very generalized, right? And how it applies in every organization and their individual division or department, right? Take the principle and then apply it your way. We have very much this hierarchical mindset. The person at the top, right, controls the strings like a puppet master, or the person at the top is the smartest person in the room. Whatever we plant in our mind, we have this traditional hierarchy where you have the CEO or the boss at the top, or even at a division or a department level, you have the boss, and then everybody else works for the boss. When we flip the chart upside down and saying the higher you go in an organization, the larger your stewardship is. If I'm a frontline employee, the customer is my stewardship. If I'm the maybe a director level or department head level, where I now oversee these individual contributors, I now have a larger stewardship. I still am responsible for customer experience, but I also am responsible for the people that provide the customer experience, right? Just because you move up in a traditional organizational chart doesn't mean that your stewardship gets smaller. So if we can shift the mindset that the person who has the biggest title, the biggest paycheck, has the biggest responsibility, and that's treated as a responsibility rather than an endowment of power. Simon Sinek recently was talking about that because you are a CEO or because you are a founder, maybe that doesn't make you a leader. You don't lead businesses, you manage businesses, you lead people. And too many people fail to recognize the responsibility of leadership and take upon themselves that mantle and that responsibility that goes with that. And so if we can upscale the understanding of what leadership is, both recognize that influence that you exhibit as a leader, right? Yeah, it can be used for good or it can be used for ill, and you have to make the choice to use it for good. Now, that good is the organization's good. If you are if you are an owner, a founder, a CEO, or a floor manager, right? Your goal is the benefit of the organization as a whole, which means you still have to hold people accountable to their job duties and responsibilities, right? You still have expectations, but you recognize that they have expectations of you as well. It's not just expectations from the top down saying that, and this is maybe my other point to this, is when we recognize that we have a mutual responsibility that results in accountability or trust, that as I do expect somebody who works for me to perform the job for which I'm paying them for, they also expect me to provide for them all the things I said I was going to in the interview process. It's very common in today's competitive work environment to, we will help train you, we'll help develop you, we'll give you opportunities for growth. And we'll even maybe talk about how, 40% of our promotions last year were internal promotions, or, roles filled were from internal promotions. And then what do? We hire people. We maybe walk them around the office floor, show them where the break room is and the bathroom is, and then we sit them down and make them watch 6 hours of online training, and then maybe we take them out to lunch, and we think that's onboarding. We think that's integrating somebody in, and then you find out a year later when they leave and they're like, yeah, I've had no coaching, I've had no training, I've had no development. And these people over here are willing to pay me, 10% more per hour. I'm going to do this for my family. And so we end up missing all of those pieces. And so it creates then, or devolves the culture into one where toxicity can exist.
That's fascinating. It's just a really fascinating breakdown of how, as you highlight, the conditions can be created for seeds of toxicity to take root, germinate, and wreak absolute havoc. We're now getting towards the end of this episode, Brian, and you've talked about breaking the cycle. Let's also highlight. So let's also spend a little bit of time talking about how leaders can begin to build trust and create a healthier culture. So once an organization has recognized that it has a toxicity problem, what are those practical steps that leaders can take to sort of rebuild organizational culture through trust?
Absolutely. And interesting, these behaviors work both for rebuilding trust if it's been lost or rebuilding a culture, but also to build in resiliency. So, hey, no matter where you're at, these are good things to do. And we talk about these more in depth in the book, and it's called the Culture Recovery Framework. So it's behaviors and mindsets around that. But keeping it at a high level, recognizing that really the first step is to reinstill organizational accountability. And what that means is that the individual feels that the organization is accountable to them, right? It's not that they're accountable to the organization. They get a paycheck. That's already there, right? If I work for somebody, I'm accountable to them no matter what, because they're the ones that control my paycheck. They control my future. They can hire or fire me, at a moment's notice. But do I feel that the organization is accountable to me? And so when senior leadership, a CEO, whoever, right, that they'll discuss challenges that are going on in the organization. Let's say a toxic leader was removed. It does start with, hey, this person didn't represent our values, right? And I know we can't always talk about every situation, but to be so naive to think that nobody else saw what was going on, we shouldn't expect that, right? We need to treat our teams as adults. And so speaking openly and freely about challenges that are going on, when we have a certain level of candor and transparency, that is meaningful. Things like being consistent with the company policies, that we don't have like, okay, this level only gets this kind of a benefit, but this level over here, they can do whatever they want, right? The idea of, when I traveled for work, the last thing I would want is to be telling the group that we need to cut back on discretionary spending, and then they watch me walk out to a luxury rental car, to go out with somebody else there, to a steak dinner, right? I made very sure that the optics, because here's the funny part is, I travel enough that I get the first class upgrades. I get the upgrades where they'll give me the expensive rental car, and I'm like, no, do you have like a Toyota or a Honda or something that I can drive? Because I can't pull up to one of my offices driving that car. I appreciate it, but I can't do that because nobody's going to pull me aside and say, hey, did you get that off of points or did the company pay for that? It's just, we're going to assume the company was there. So when we can exhibit this organizational accountability, then that gives us an opportunity to have individual accountability. And again, this is the supervisor or the leader to their direct associate. So this is a one-to-one relationship, right? And these are things like actually seeking after difficult conversations. How are we doing? How are things going? Oh, everything's fine. No, really, how are they going? Right? And you actually pressure test and you push back and you create an environment that's then two-way, where they can actually give critique and that you act on that. And if you can't act on it for some reason, maybe it's an employee investigation or somebody wants a raise or whatever, and you can't, you come back and you're honest. You don't just, oh yeah, no, we're still thinking about it. We're still talking about it. No, you say, hey, I'd love to do that. We can't right now. I'm going to work on some things over the next 6 months to see if we can put ourselves in position to do that, because, as you shared with me, it's important to you, and what's important to you is important to me, but I can't do that today, and here's why. Having that level of accountability, then it leads us to that one-to-one accountability evolves to become one-to-one trust. I was talking about this with somebody yesterday, where a former person that I reported to, I never once questioned when that person gave me critical feedback, even if it stung. All right. I'm like, oh, that hurt. I would recognize that real quick because that's an emotional response, but I never once questioned why this person was giving me the feedback. I trusted that, and I'm going to use a quick definition of trust here from Stephen M.R. Covey. He talks about trust, and in English language, we use it kind of two ways interchangeably. One's a moral trust, and one's a capability trust. Right, I would trust somebody to re-roof my house that had a roofing company, but I wouldn't necessarily give them my wallet. It's the difference between that moral trust. This person had exhibited over time both accountability and trust, that I knew that this person wasn't trying to hurt me, right? That kind of that moral trust, but also the capability trust. They were very well versed in this particular area that they were giving me critique. And they weren't trying to play that they were smarter, but I knew that that person cared. And so I was able to receive that. That exhibited over time through multiple people then leads ultimately to organizational trust, where the individual person trusts the organization as a whole, which is really where you build the resiliency, because every organization is going to have some turkeys. That's going to happen. If we have people, either customers or employees, you're going to have some people that are difficult to navigate or to deal with. But that's when I can overlook the individual because I trust the organization as a whole.
And that's fascinating. And I like this concept of accountability that you present. I've always seen accountability as a flat hierarchy. As you highlighted, you're as accountable to me if you're my chief executive as I am to you as your subordinate. It's a flat hierarchy, and it's not always looked at in that way. Sometimes, in many organizations, the most senior person sees themselves as the person to whom an accountability is owed. And I think what you've presented is actually the truth of the situation. It is a flat hierarchy. But Brian, for my last question, it's just basically about how organizations, once they come through this whole cycle of experiencing toxicity, being able to identify what the problem is, being able to break the cycle, how do they ensure that they don't end up in the same situation again 6 months later, a year later? Because there is a real challenge here about organizational memory. People who have been through it, who have overcome it, move, they leave the organization, and then new people come in who don't have the same knowledge and experience. What are your thoughts on that, Brian?
Oh, yeah. That you've seen this before, right? It's this idea that we had a problem, so we created a solution, and the solution worked so well that we stopped doing it. And then it pops back up again because we were too often addressing symptoms or thinking of it in a symptoms mindset rather than it's somebody that loses weight because they're told that they need to get healthy. Oh, they're healthy now, I can get off my medications. And then they start to lax on their diet and exercise again, and they end up in the same situation multiple years later. People do this, organizations. I think this is probably a reality or a human frailty, right? Is that short-term memory when it comes to pain and suffering. You know, when I'm coaching organizations, this is the idea of the culture recovery framework, right? And we describe as kind of this circle. It's not a set of behaviors that you do to solve a problem and then stop. There become organizational behaviors that are table stakes. They're absolute minimum expectations of the organization. And there are ways to measure it, and you can do this through performance reviews or other things, but the goal is the things that work to build resiliency can't stop. They have to keep going. Now, you presented something interesting, that organizations will have new faces, new people, right? Looking at that from two sides, sometimes new senior leadership will come in, again, divisionally, departmentally, organizationally, with a new CEO. Everybody's got their own new initiatives. I've seen tons of organizations where every 1 or 2 years, they got their new thing that they do, right? Somebody went to a workshop and they're all pumped up about it. Those can still exist, and maybe that in itself is also another podcast. But you can have these organization, the highlight of the month kind of initiatives you want to do. This can't be an initiative. This has to become rooted in the core DNA of the organization, right? For example, high levels of communication, right? If you are a poor communicator, and then you learn about effective and reflective listening, let's say, and you now exhibit these behaviors, those should now be part of what you do in any circumstance. So as you're promoted in the organization, you don't just stop communicating well, right? In fact, that's probably what helped you get promoted in the first place. Or as you get new people, one of the things that we do need to recognize as new people are coming into the organization is, right now anyway, most organizations don't operate at this level of organizational health. And so you have to have some grace. I'll give an example. It's slightly different, but it kind of gives a point. I worked for an organization where I'd come from organization A to work at organization B. Organization A, in my compensation plan, I had 4 weeks of vacation per year. I was not able to take any more than like 2 or 3 days a year, because the way that it was set up, it was like, it not only looked bad, it was kind of frowned upon to take vacation time. So it looked good in an offer letter, but it didn't reflect an actual practical ability. And, at that point, my kids were getting older, and I wanted to be able to have at least a little bit of time. And for me, I believe that vacation can be earned, right? You empower your team to succeed when you're not there, right? That's actually a sign of good, healthy organization, healthy leadership. So I'm now working with Organization B, and I had already had an anniversary trip actually to to the UK. As we were talking about that earlier, to the UK with my wife, and we were excited about going, and we chose to fly through Iceland. We added a couple extra stops on the trip. I had told my new boss I had this trip plan. No problem, no worries. I had told him about this vacation experience that I had. So we flew out. The sun was still out at 11 o'clock at night, and it was a weekend that we had traveled on. But I'm on vacation. I start checking some emails and doing some other stuff like that, just because that's probably my muscle memory. Monday morning, he comes in, sees that I'm on email. He calls the IT department, tells them to shut off my email. And I get back, whatever it was, week 10 days later, and first question, he's like, did anybody die? Did anything burn down? I'm like, no, everything's awesome. He's like, great. Now learn to take your vacation. Now, he never cut off my email again, right? I didn't get that same thing, but he was trying to prove a point. So when we bring in new people that have muscle memory from poor organizations, we need to give them a little bit of grace to recognize that they're not going to operate at the level of communication and trust and accountability that we are, because they're not used to that. But also, we may have to force that issue and maybe even provide some opportunities for them to learn that lesson for themselves, that we are legitimate in our values. They're not just written on the conference room wall, that these are actually things that we live, and we'll create instances to prove that to you.
Brian, that's been brilliant. Really, really brilliant. And I think, as you said, I mean, there's plenty of information trading there for for a whole series of podcasts, actually, quite frankly. It's been brilliant. Brian, if there were sort of three key takeaways from all of the information, the wealth of information that you've shared on this episode, what would they be?
First off, I'm just going to run these off the cuff here. First off, having toxic leaders come into your organization is inevitable. That will happen. But having a toxic culture, or a culture that is accepting of those toxic leaders when they come in, is entirely your choice. And you can build resiliency to prevent that from happening. And one of the best things I like to see is when you see middle management or above, that they only last 4 or 5 months, because they're testing. They're finding out they're not going to get any traction. They just go on to the next organization, almost like a victim and a bully kind of a situation. Maybe that's number one. Number two, that we need to flip that organizational chart around, and we need to recognize that corporate shared services or the C-suite is a support structure to help our individual contributors along the way take care of gaining and retaining customers. That's that relationship. That you used something when you were referencing that conversation with me, which was that sometimes people feel that accountability or honor is owed them, and that's that mentality we need to break. And that happens at every level of the organization. I've seen the most humble CEOs. You go down 13 or 14 layers, and you have people that have a complete power trip. So it needs to be rooted out across the way. Third thing is, the answer is generally in the room. That when we create places, and we can use words like psychological safety or other things, but when we create an environment where people feel like they have not just the accountability, but that their opinions are welcome. And not every opinion is of equal value, right? Especially if we're dealing with something that's very complex, right? Somebody that has no experience in that may not be the right voice to have in the room, but we need to consider what voices we should have in the room. And the answer is usually there, right? And if it's a customer issue, though, it's probably not decided inside the four walls of the conference room. Let's get some of those voices, which might be customers or others. And so there's an opportunity to rethink about how we engage with our existing team.
Dr. Brian Hughes, I mean, this has been such an insightful episode of the podcast, but we're not going to let you go just yet. We want to find out a little bit more about you, Brian. You're an author, you're a consultant. Tell our listeners more about Dr. Brian Hughes.
Mm. Yeah. So, people can check me out on LinkedIn, or, either LinkedIn's under my name, but Clear Day Strategies is my consulting company. And so if you go to Clear Day Strategies on really any of the other social channels, you can follow me. I just had a TED Talk published around the most, well, I think the title was they settled on was the most human skill in the age of AI. And so, talking about some of that organizational benefits of AI. But yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation with anybody. Like you mentioned the book, I appreciate that. Thank you. The book's available Amazon internationally, here in North America through other outlets, retail otherwise. But really what my time is spent doing is helping organizations heal or mitigate. I come with 3 decades of operational experience leading teams, right? I've been in sales, I've been in operations, all of that kind of stuff to me is table stakes. And it was the organizational health that was really the missing piece. And so while I spend a lot of time on that, right, I would never characterize myself as equal to one of my, HR colleagues or people that just focus on that. For me, I'm thinking people become the multiplier to the operational value, right? Not a commodity or a line item that's just a necessary evil as part of doing that. But, if I could, I think the one thing, and this is going to be another one of those squishy, touchy-feely kind of words, but if somebody had a takeaway, is to ask themselves, do they feel like they have a collaborative environment? And a collaborative environment really implies that regardless of your title, to somebody who reports maybe a couple layers down from you, do they feel comfortable coming up to you with an idea or a critique or criticism? And do you know, as an individual, how to take that, not judge them, because the package might not be that pretty, right? If it's a line level employee, they may not have all the right terminology, but they can see things that we can't. Frito-Lay has a great example where the flavor of flaming hot Cheetos, big thing here in the States, that was actually, that idea was brought forth by somebody that was a night janitor sweeping the floors. And I don't know all the details around that. My understanding is that person got like both public credit inside the organization and was also compensated monetarily for that. But that person felt like they could bring an idea to the table. And they weren't judged. They weren't, oh, what do you do? Well, we've got all of these brilliant university trained, food scientists over here, and we've got this amazing marketing department. But it was somebody in overalls, in a broom that brought one of the best selling products that they have to the table, right? And there's tons of examples like that. But are we not only looking for those when they happen, but are we creating an environment that makes those happen, that encourages those to happen? We do that, I think some of the toxicity stuff will start to get handled on its own.
Dr. Brian Hughes, author, consultant, leadership expert. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the 11th Thing podcast. It's been great to have you.
Yeah, Paul, it's been amazing. Thank you for the invite.
Finally, before I sign off, can I ask that listeners please share this podcast across your social networks? Please also check out previous episodes of the 11th Thing podcast. And if you want to know more about the issues being covered in this series, head over to Believenomics on YouTube and TikTok for a sneak peek. There are a range of videos there which I'm sure you'll find really helpful. Finally, you may also want to check out Paula Ladinica on medium.com, where I post a new blog once a week. Thanks for listening.